So as Will mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the LSE. This is my first year as an assistant professor there. I got a postdoc at Columbia Business School, and before that I got my PhD at the University of California, Irvine, everything in management. But I've always been deeply interested in well-being, so I was very excited when Will presented me with this opportunity to come and talk about some of my research. In fact, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I organized, designed, and implemented this workshop for our PhD students to help them craft a cohesive and coherent narrative around their academic identity. And I came up with this exercise, sort of inductive exercise. Think about keywords around your research projects. And before implementing the workshop, I did this exercise on my own research. And the most important theme in my research was actually well-being. So I'm in the process of recrafting my own identity to bring well-being as a core part of how I present myself. But currently, when I talk about my identity as an academic, I talk about two aspects of it. Mainly, the first one has to do with sustainability and corporate social responsibility. Within that, I do a lot of work on employee volunteering. And then the other one has to do with emotions, very broadly defined. I have a few papers on emotions, and I'm very nerdy on emotions. I actually have a couple of theory papers where I just love theorizing on the role of different sets of interpersonal emotions at work and how they help in employees' well-being and different aspects of social well-being. So today, I'm actually presenting a paper that sits at the intersection of these two broad research interests that I have. The paper is titled "The Effects of Employee Exposure to Community Impact Activities on Their Emotions and Subsequent Engagement in Volunteering." And this is a field experiment that I implemented back in 2018 in the largest bank in Peru, where I used to be a CSR manager before starting my academic journey. So I worked there through 2015, and then I moved to the States to start my PhD. And I'm in the process of rewriting this piece with Jessica Rodell from the University of Georgia. I would start by presenting just a couple of findings from another working paper I have with Caterina Gonzalez from Suffolk University, and Aaron Ajula, who is a fantastic, brilliant PhD student from the LSE, just to talk a little bit about the motivation to study volunteering in general. And then I will go into this paper. And as Will mentioned, I have already published a paper out of this one intervention that looks at turnover. So if there's a tiny bit of time, I will bring these two pieces of work from the same intervention together by presenting some joint analysis to show that I didn't really just pick and choose variables, but that these are actually two different stories that deserve to be two different papers. So the first, as motivation, is a paper that I've been working on for a couple of years now, on the distinction between employees' engagement in corporate versus personal volunteering. And I don't think I need to provide a lot of motivation for why volunteering is important, but there it goes. There's more than 1 billion volunteers every year around the world, and at least half of these are employees. And we find that employee volunteering is one of the only portions of volunteering, broadly defined, that it's actually growing. It's kept growing over the past 2 to 3 decades, and organizations have a big role in this growth of employee volunteering, with many organizations offering different types of support for employees to engage in volunteering. Now, when we think about volunteering and employee volunteering, I like to present this process model where there are different motivations for employees to volunteer. There are different self-oriented motivations, different other-oriented motivations. In the context of work, these self-oriented motivations do play a prominent role to bring people in to volunteer. Then when we talk about volunteering direction, is the decision to become a volunteer. And you can think of this mainly as a dummy variable. 0, they don't volunteer. 1, they are a volunteer. Then people engage in volunteering activities with different intensity, and there are different ways of measuring this, but this is in general the frequency of engagement in volunteering activities. And once they go through any given volunteering activity, people are going to evaluate their own experience volunteering. And then at the end of this model, we could introduce yet another operationalization of conceptualization of volunteering, which is called volunteering persistence, whether they engage again in a different or the same the next year, for example, volunteering activity. So I've conducted a meta-analytic review on the literature on employee volunteering, just to map out the strength of the associations between employees' engagement in volunteering and a different set of organizational outcomes. And as you can see from this table, the association between employees' engagement in volunteering and different sets of outcomes from employee well-being, different types of attitudes and perceptions, behavioral outcomes such as performance or citizenship behaviors and turnover, all of these associations are at least moderate in magnitude. So this talks about the importance of volunteering and the potential beneficial outcomes for both employees and their organizations of engaging in volunteering activities. There are 2 large types of volunteering activities that employees can engage in. One of these is corporate volunteering, so engaging in a corporate sponsored social impact activity, or just going outside of work to my local nonprofit to do some volunteering on the site. There's no consensus in the literature. I couldn't find really a paper that had this as the main question to ask. So what is the difference between the two? So in this one paper, I tried to answer this question. And in this paper, I'm not going deep into this paper. I have 4 studies. I'm going to present the results of one study that looks at the moderation effect of the samples included in a meta-analysis being from personal or corporate volunteering. And I look at 3 large sets of outcomes. So the first one are attitudes towards the organization. And we see using meta-regression analysis that when employees engage in corporate volunteering, and you can see the meta-analytic effects for each of the subgroups at the bottom, you see that the strength of the association between volunteering and organizational attitudes when employees engage in corporate volunteering is significantly stronger than when they engage in personal volunteering. And of course, this makes sense. And it is pretty much the same case for different types of behaviors when clustered together. Think of performance, OCV, turnover. We see moderate effect sizes when we talk about employees' engagement in volunteering at the bottom right part of this table. And we see weak effect sizes when employees engage in personal volunteering in terms of associations with organizational behaviors. Now, this is also the case, which to me was surprising when I started conducting this analysis a couple of years ago when talking about well-being. Because it makes sense, right? For if I engage in corporate volunteering, it's an opportunity provided by the organization. So that should strengthen my attitudes towards my employer. Maybe that through social exchange or identification is going to allow me to also perform better as an employee. But what about well-being? I also find the same type of effects where when employees engage in corporate volunteering, the associations with different sets of well-being, of indicators of well-being, are stronger than when they engage in personal volunteering. So in this other paper, I go deep into this and I try to look at different alternative explanations for these main effects. And this a very cool paper, I think, as of today, where we combine a large archival study from a nationally representative sample of people in the US, a field study implemented in Peru with unique characteristics that allows us to test this distinction between corporate and personal volunteering, this meta-analysis, and then a fourth study where we switch levels of analysis and look at firm level outcomes of having or not having corporate volunteering programs. So it seems to me that it seems to be, not doesn't seem to be, it is that the effects of employee engagement in corporate volunteering in different sets of outcomes are stronger than the effects of engagement in personal volunteering. However, the literature on volunteering suffers from a lot of self-selection. So people, by definition, self-select into volunteering. So it's really hard to assess whether these effects are driven by the participant, the volunteer, or their actual experience of being in a social impact program. So this has led to this inability to establish this causal relationship between participation in these types of activities and different sets of employees' perceptions or outcomes in general, which was the main motivation for me to design back in 2017 this field experiment that I will be presenting next. The main reason, since I already went through the motivation for study this, the main research, I have two research questions for this paper. The first one is volunteering actually an emotionally laden experience? And specifically, I look at whether it elicits organizational pride and workplace empathy. And as well, I look at the implications of the emotions that are sparked by employee engagement in volunteering for both companies and communities that are part of these volunteering activities. Now, I'm not going to talk broadly about any sort of volunteering activity, but I'm going to talk more about these one-shot, episodic, or short-term corporate sponsor volunteering activities, such as a volunteering intervention. Like, okay, a day of cleaning up beaches or roadsides, planting trees, or these short-term community outreach activities. These are a couple of pictures of the intervention that I implemented back in 2018, and I'll talk a bit more about the intervention in a second. But we do know that organizations are increasingly implementing these one-shot corporate volunteering interventions as part of their strategic repertoire of CSR activities. However, we don't really know what are the effects of these type of volunteering activities. Much of the literature on volunteering has looked at these longer-term volunteering programs and not at the more episodic engagement in volunteering. So what can we expect? I mean, when thinking about this, you can come up with arguments that would say, you know, the effects of volunteering are driven by volunteering persistence and intensity, such that if you only give them like a one opportunity, maybe we won't see a significant effect of their engagement. However, the literature from social psychology focusing on interventions suggests that when you, through these type of activities, can effectively alter people's perceptions of either themselves, of others, their situation, this can actually trigger downstream behavioral consequences, right? And this new emerging literature on wise interventions speaks very well about the effects of these short-term interventions. So in this paper, I look specifically at two different conceptualizations of volunteering, and I will be looking at both volunteering direction and volunteering intensity. And this is the theoretical model that I test through this field experiment. I look at whether this affective event, and I'll talk about this employee exposure to corporate volunteering, leads to a heightened sense of organizational pride and a stronger experience of workplace empathy. And I look at whether these two emotional constructs actually drive the effects of exposure to corporate volunteering onto two sets of outcomes. One that directly benefits the organization, effective commitment, and another one that directly benefits the community, which is subsequent engagement in corporate volunteering activities. Now, most of the literature on volunteering, and particularly the literature on employee volunteering, has taken this very rational approach where there are different functions that volunteering fulfills. However, I believe that we're missing out on the emotionally laden experience of volunteering. And so here we're conceptualizing employee exposure to volunteering as an effective experience for them. And this is based on the fact that participation in volunteering in general is many times very often described as feel-good experiences. And there's some research that has shown that when individuals engage in volunteering, they experience an immediate short-term increase in positive affect. And this suggests that it is actually an effective experience for employees engaging in volunteering. I don't know if any of you has engaged in volunteering. I have, and it does feel good, right? So it is an emotional experience, and there are like ups and downs as well. If you're engaging with a beneficiary, and the beneficiary is from like a vulnerable population, through empathy, you're gonna feel some unpleasant emotions, and then through helping them and seeing their positive reaction, then those unpleasant emotions are gonna turn into positive emotions. So in general, engagement in volunteering is an effective experience. Now, we know from the literature on pleasant emotions that the experience of these pleasant emotions in general motivates individuals to search for and engage in similar events or experiences that are going to trigger the same emotions, which is the basic argument that we use to then say like, oh, if you actually expose individuals to this sort of intervention, then they're going to look for other opportunities with similar content. Thus, we would expect them to engage at higher rates and with stronger frequency in subsequent corporate volunteering opportunities. Now, this is the main theoretical framework for this is affective events theory, which is a framework developed for the study of emotions in the context of work, in which an affective event, which is just a situation that impacts your well-being or your goal achievement, any significant event that triggers emotions is going to trigger these episodic emotions. And through your experience of episodic emotions, which are these reactions to affective events, you can see changes, potential changes in attitudes and subsequent behaviors. What we're doing here, what we're adding here is this additional mediator from these more episodic emotions that happen from participating in the event to these more enduring emotions, also called sentiments, which are these more predispositions to experience an episodic form of affect in a given context or towards a particular target. Now, because of what we were doing in this study, we couldn't compare the experience of episodic emotions across groups of treated and controlled individuals. So the best approach was to actually look at enduring emotions, which then let us think about this additional theoretical contribution to the literature on effective events theories, that suggesting that through the experience of episodic emotions, you can see an effect on enduring emotions, and it is that effect on enduring emotions that can actually trickle down into stronger attitudes or more adaptive behaviors at work. Now, going into the field experiment, as I mentioned, this was a field experiment implemented in the largest bank in Peru. This bank is a key player in wholesale and retail banking and has operations throughout Latin America and the US, more than 400 branches. At that point, close to 18,000 employees, more than 6 million customers. And it was like an average bank in terms of their social responsibility compared to other leading banks in the region. We implemented this field experiment as part of the onboarding process. The regular onboarding process had 2 day-long activities. The first day-long activity was a cultural induction where employees were all day long with other with other peers that had joined within the same 2-week period, and then a second day long where they were sent to a local branch to learn about bank transactions and activities, which is the core of what the bank does. Every employee is given up to 3 possible dates to complete each of these 2-day-long activities that are part of the onboarding process. We created a 3rd day-long activity to be part of this onboarding process, which was this corporate volunteering intervention. And we randomly assigned a subset of new employees that had already completed day 1 and day 2 to either participate or to be part of a no treatment control group. This is the timeline. In May of 2018, we selected the sample of employees. We selected 221 employees, which was 1/3 of the total number of employees that had joined the bank in that metropolitan area by that time. Because of what we know, because of employees get up to 3 opportunities to participate, but we were only implementing the intervention once, we knew that around 60% of employees that were randomly assigned to the treatment were going to end up being treated. So we had to get 158 employees into the randomly assign them to the treatment group, because we knew that close to 60% were going to participate, and then 63 were randomly assigned to the control group, which is at the end what ended happening. So 91 employees were treated, 67 employees couldn't participate, and 63 employees were part of this no treatment control group. A couple of weeks after the implementation of the intervention, we had this post-treatment survey that was part of the onboarding process. So all the employees, treated employees, could not participate employees, and control employees responded to this survey. We had pretty high response rates. And then a year later, through the CSR team at the bank, we collected information on volunteering behavior that allowed us to operationalize both volunteering direction as a dummy variable and volunteering intensity as the number, as a count variable, telling us how many times, in how many activities they engage in volunteering. Now, the intervention, the context of the intervention was this public high school, where the goal was for employees to have this one-on-one coaching session with these senior high school students from this public high school. And then this happened in Peru, where senior students from public high school have very few opportunities to make a decent living without a university degree. And it is extremely hard for these students to pay for a private university. And the few high-quality public universities are extremely competitive. And students often apply several times throughout many years to get in. So the goal of the intervention was for participating employees to coach high school students to help them envision an attainable future after graduation that will help them reduce their anxiety about the future. Side note, we actually collected pre- and post-treatment information on a number of indicators of well-being, including anxiety about the future, on the beneficiaries, on these high school students. But of course, we didn't have a control group, but we did see a huge drop on all of these negative indicators of well-being, including anxiety about the future. So this is a bit of how we structure the intervention. First, there was a training component that happened at the bank, and it was 90 minutes. And from there, we just make sure that this was actually felt as an effective experience for employees. Lots of energy in the room. There was a lot of role play, laughter, truly an amazing experience. Then we took by bus all the employees to the high school place where they had the one-on-one coaching session. Before that, there was a little bit of icebreaker, so they could build a tiny bit of rapport between the employee that was assigned to the high school student. We designed all the materials to allow the employees to be effective in delivering this one-on-one coaching session. And this is a picture of both employee participants, and high school students at the end of the session. And then a third portion of the treatment of the intervention was this hour-long debriefing session where it started with individual reflection, then group reflection, and then a debriefing among all the employees. And this is a picture of all the participating employees at the end of this portion, and then back to the bus to go back to the bank. Because we're interested in studying employee exposure to corporate volunteering, the main analysis, the main effects that we assess through comparison of treated versus control employees, but we do run different sets of analysis looking at just plainly intent to treat, comparing the people that were treated versus the people that were not treated. So clustering the people that could not participate with the people that were randomly assigned to the control group. Just when looking at those two groups, there were no significant differences in any sort of observable or outcomes between the two groups, so that also made sense. And we also used instrumental variables to run a treatment on the instrumented treated analysis. And we ran several robustness checks across. So our first research question again is volunteering an emotionally laden phenomena? Does employee volunteering elicit pride and empathy? So first we look at the satisfaction survey implemented right at the end of the intervention only to the treated employees. And they reported extremely high levels of satisfaction, as well as satisfaction with different aspects of the intervention, including impact on them, impact on beneficiaries, organization, duration, training. And in addition, all but one employee said that they would recommend the intervention to other employees, all but two that would participate again, and all but one that would incorporate it as a formal component of the onboarding process. So what are the effects of the intervention on employees' organizational pride? Well, it is a significant effect, an R-square of 0.46, which is actually a pretty large effect when you're thinking that this is just exposure to a day-long intervention. And these are measures that happen 2 weeks after the intervention. We also find a significant and even stronger effect, an R-square of 0.09 on workplace empathy. And this is a contextualized measure of empathy, so the level of empathy that you feel when interacting with, in general, any other stakeholder in the context of work. I do a lot of research on gratitude, so I had some ideas and some arguments as to why it could influence gratitude, but I couldn't find. There were no effects of the intervention of gratitude, which suggests that this is not just a positive affective effect, but that there are specific emotional mechanisms at play in here. So the answer to the first question is yes, it seems to be an emotionally laden experience, and it does elicit both organizational pride and workplace empathy. So the second question is, what are the implications of these emotions sparked by employee volunteering for both the company and the community? And this is where we bring in affective commitment to see the effects for the company and subsequent engagement in volunteering to better understand the potential effects of the intervention on the community. And we find, again, a statistically significant effect, but not a strong and effective commitment. And we find that the effect of the intervention is driven by employees' sense of organizational pride onto effective commitment, not workplace empathy. And then we looked at our two behavioral operationalizations of subsequent engagement in volunteering. And we find that people that were randomly assigned to the control group decided at a rate of 14.5% to become volunteers, compared to 33% of the people that were exposed to this treatment that became volunteers in the following year. And again, this is the effect that we find. One of the employees in one of the answers to the satisfaction survey said, I've been at the bank for a short time and I still don't know how their corporate volunteering works, but it'll be great if they open calls so that employees can participate. And this This is right after their participation, and they did end up signing up at higher rates. And when we look at this count variable of the number of sessions they attended throughout the next year, we also find an effect. And interestingly, we find that the effect of the intervention is not driven by the sense of organizational pride onto subsequent engagement in volunteering, but by their sense of empathy in the context of work. So each of these emotions functions to drive effects of the intervention onto different sets of outcomes, which is quite interesting. One of the employees said, as bank employees, we play a crucial role in helping different people make their dreams and life projects come true in an empathic way, engaging in active listening. And so the key takeaway is that exposure to a day-long corporate volunteering activity can have downstream consequences on employees' enduring emotions, effective commitment, and volunteering behavior, and that these effects are net of the impact of individual characteristics that might actually be driving sex selection to participate in these sorts of activities. And then just to conclude, and very shortly, the other side of this intervention was published in Management Science last year. I'm not looking at employee exposure in the activity, but I'm looking at the effects of this short-term activity. So the main analysis is conducted by looking at a traditional intent to treat analysis as opposed to a treatment on the treated of sorts. And we find that the people that were randomly assigned to the control condition left the bank at a rate of almost 35%, compared to the people that were actually treated that left the bank at a rate of 16.5%, and the people that were randomly assigned to the treatment left at a rate of 20.9%. And we found that these effects for turnover were driven by employees' perceptions of how just their organization is. So bringing it all together, I test, could it be the case that that perceptions of justice actually lead to volunteering, or that empathy leads to turnover? And that is not the case. So both of those paths are not significant. So the story on turnover is a story about perception of justice, and the story on subsequent volunteering is a story about workplace empathy. And with these sets of papers, I contribute to the literature on volunteering, social responsibility, and positive emotions at work. So thank you so much. And we still have 13 minutes for questions.